Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. We are ready to start. And we are so glad you are here and you are at the NC CASA training Building Advocacy Skills to Serve Trafficked Minors. And this webinar is going to build on a general understanding of human trafficking and trauma-informed service delivery. It will equip rape crisis centers and other direct service agencies with skills and strategies to identify and respond to minor victims of human trafficking. It will also provide practical tips for separating youth from traffickers in different settings and provide information about current legislative policy as it pertains to mandated reporting, confidentiality, privileged communication, and other related legal issues for more effective service delivery to trafficked minors. I'm Courtney Dunkerton. I'm the anti-human trafficking specialist with NC CASA and will be co-presenting with Sky David, NC CASA's staff attorney. And also providing support to this webinar is Robin Colbert, the associate director here at NC CASA, who will be responding to things in the chat and facilitating any questions and comments and bringing those to our attention. And Alexandra Smith, who is here providing tech support. So we welcome you. And I'm sure you all are virtual training pros by now. Please feel free to say hi in the chat, and we'd appreciate it if you would take your Zoom name and add your preferred pronouns as well as the agency or organization that you represent. So the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault is an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. As a statewide coalition, we use a social justice framework. Therefore, our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. And by centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. Some of the work we do includes organizing and sponsoring statewide trainings related to sexual violence, supporting rape crisis programs, resource sharing and technical assistance, legislative agendas and policy change on the local and national level, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, and work on colleges and universities. And we want to acknowledge as we begin that not all women are victims, not all men are harm doers. Any gender can be a victim, any gender can be a harm doer. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I will be covering parts 1 through 4. We'll go through a brief overview of human trafficking as it pertains to minors. We'll talk about traffickers and their business models and methods, identifying trafficked minors, and then responding to suspected trafficked minors. And then Sky will talk about legislation and policy, and we're going to go through, or she will go through some scenarios that will reflect some real life situations that you may be wondering about. Please put your questions in the chat. They can be shared in the chat or directly sent to the panelists. And just please be aware, this is an overview of this topic. It does assume some basic understanding of human trafficking. So we'll cover content that is unique to minors, but some parts of it may feel or seem superficial in the time that we're providing for it. It's a broad subject with lots of pieces. We do intend to do a deeper dive later this year. And so your feedback and comments and questions are very valuable and will help shape that and help inform us where we need to go. So I also want to mention as we start out that this content may be triggering. We're going to be referring to various expressions of harm. So please do take care of yourself. I'm sure you're aware that we will be covering some difficult things. But this topic, child trafficking, is very, very heavy. It can be very overwhelming, and quite honestly, we can feel very powerless when we learn about this, right? So just maybe plan after the training to take a walk or take a break, whatever feels helpful to you. Sometimes it helps me to check in with a coworker and just talk about the subject, or not talk about something else. So just whatever you need to do to take care of yourself during this and after this training, please do. And we want this to be meaningful to you, so your responses and questions are very important, and we're going to do everything we can to address your concerns and questions. So before we take a dive into our topic, we would like to go through a couple of questions in terms of a poll. Alexandra was going to facilitate that for us.
All right, so you all should have access to the poll now. Please let me know if you can't see it.
So we'll give you all a few minutes to, or a minute or so to respond. How often have you received training specifically on trafficking of minors? I have not received training specifically on trafficking of minors. 1 to 2 trainings, 3 or more trainings. And then who provided this training? Statewide coalitions or organizations, religious or faith-based organization, local agency, national or out-of-state organization, or others. And Alexandra, I'll just wait for when you're ready to share those results.
So it looks like we're just waiting on a couple more people to get their answers in. So as soon as we've got those answers in, I'll end the poll, which means that you all will be able to view them.
Thanks.
So we're going to go ahead and end the polling. If you didn't get a chance to respond, please feel free to enter your response in the chat. So you all should be able to see it now, see the responses.
So 57% has not received training specifically on trafficking of minors. 33% of you 1 to 2, and then 3 or more. 10% of you are pros, 3 or more trainings, and the majority looks like, well, it says other. 33% statewide coalition, 3% religious or faith-based, local agency 10%, national out of state would be 10%, and other 53%. Thank you so much for providing that information. That's very helpful. All right. So the basics. So what is human trafficking? We're talking of essentially it's compelled labor or services. It's when someone else is compelling or causing someone to perform labor or services. It involves different activities such as inducing someone, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining through some sort of force, some sort of fraud or coercive behavior for the purpose of commercial sex or other kinds of labor and services. Very important caveat to note is anyone under 18, they cannot consent to commercial sex. So those under 18 are considered victims. I just want to note that trafficking is not the same thing as smuggling. Smuggling is a consensual contract made between 2 people to bring one person over the border into another country. It can turn into trafficking, but smuggling is not the same thing. Also, trafficking does not require any kind of transportation or movement. Sometimes the name human trafficking makes us think sometimes that is required. Some common industries that we see human trafficking is domestic service, food or hotel industries, the logging industry, fishing, agriculture, construction, meat processing, factory work, door-to-door traveling sales, resorts or fairs, carnivals, massage or nail salons. It also includes some underground economies such as drug or weapon sales, begging, panhandling, and of course, commercial sex. And Sky is going to do a deeper dive into the technical language, and I'm so happy about that. But I did want to note again that that child sex trafficking is a subset of human trafficking, and this does not require the existence or you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, right? Because a minor cannot consent to commercial sex. When we talk about CSEC, we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation of a child, and that generally refers to having no third-party facilitator. So someone would be directly connected with someone, with a minor who is exchanging sex for something of value. Domestic minor sex trafficking, or DMST, usually assumes a third-party facilitator. Sometimes we refer to that person as a pimp or a trafficker or a handler, but it's going to be a third party. A buyer or a John refers to a person purchasing or trading something for a sex act, and commercial sex is any sex act where something of value is given or exchanged, and that could be money, of course, drugs, a place to stay, paying off a debt. So the question that is often asked is, how big a problem is trafficking? How many people are being trafficked? How many children are being trafficked? Which state or which city has the most trafficking? And the simple answer is we don't know. We have not quantified this problem accurately, but what we do know is we can track a number of calls to the human trafficking hotline. I'm sure many of you are aware of this map on the right. It's a heat map that shows where the calls to this hotline have taken place, and you see North Carolina is well represented there. On the left is a heat map of population concentration, so you can just sort of compare. More calls are going to exist where there's more population. One thing the hotline calls do reflect is a lot of awareness going on about human trafficking. More people are aware of it and are calling in about it, maybe for help, maybe for themselves, maybe for something that they are seeing. When we want to know how many children are being trafficked, I mean, that's a really important number that we would like to know. How many minors are trafficked in the United States? Again, we don't know. But what do we know, or what can we know? Unfortunately, most attempts to quantify the problem is based on outdated data or poor research, or statistics that have been long been discredited. We can look at targeted data, such as regional homeless youth programs, and that can give us insight as well as reliable stats about other victimizations and contributing factors. So that's what we're going to look at right now, just for a minute. So a couple of data points. Homeless youth in Atlanta metro area between ages of 14 or 25 years old were surveyed, and I have Robin can share that that research in the chat. This was collected between September and November in 2018, where sweeps were conducted. Homeless youth, where they were known to spend time in 5 metro areas, were surveyed. And they reported that 1 in every 2 youth surveyed experienced 1 or more forms of human trafficking in their lifetime. Now, this includes labor trafficking as well. 1 in 3 youth surveyed experienced 1 or more forms of human trafficking while homeless. So this doesn't tell us how many kids were trafficked, but this gives us very important understanding of what human trafficking looks like and how it impacts youth, homeless youth. Also, based on the demographics, the risk factors for experiencing sex and labor trafficking include youth, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth, transgender youth, youth experiencing homelessness for more than 1 year, youth with high levels of childhood trauma, and youth with previous systems involvement. Now, why is this important? what does this tell us? What does this research tell us about minors and human trafficking? And if you'd like to engage in the chat on that, please do. That's really, really important. In 2019, Minnesota conducted a student survey in which they asked, it was their first estimate of youth sexual exploitation. And I will, here's the, so at least 5,000 or 1.4% of those surveyed answered yes to the question, have you ever traded sex or sexual activity to receive food, money, drugs, alcohol, a place to stay, or anything else? And that is significant. And of course, that refers to the kids that did say yes, assuming that there are others that did not say yes, and the ones who showed up that day for that particular survey. Did I mention it was, yes, it was 71,000 9th, 10th, and 11th graders were surveyed. So this survey was for 9th, 10th, and 11th graders across 8 Minnesota regions. And again, what does that tell us? Actually, let me share this. Of those who said yes, 1.2 of them were cisgender boy, and cis is the gender assigned at birth. 1.3 of those who said yes, cisgender girl. 5.9 transgender youth. 3.3 were unsure of their gender identity. 12% of those saying yes at some point were in a juvenile correctional facility. 8.1 were in foster care. 7.7% of those who said yes experienced sexual violence at some point in their life, and 6.4 of those who said yes experienced housing instability in the last year. And again, why is this information important? What is this telling us? Who is showing up as vulnerable to being trafficked? All right. Robin, is there anything you'd like to share from the chat? Anything of note?
Still can't find my mute button. Unmute button. No, I did do as you requested, Court. I did put both of those reports in the chat for folks who want to go back and look at those. So the Atlanta Youth Count report is in the chat, as well as the Minnesota report, but there are no comments or questions in the chat around those two reports, or any comments around your question.
All right, thank you, Robin, and that's fine, thanks. So we'll talk a little bit about traffickers. In terms of minors, when we talk about a trafficker, we're referring to those perpetuating the trafficking scheme. You remember all the activities: induce, recruits, harbors, transport, keeping a minor in forced or coerced labor or services. And also it's going to be anyone involved in the commercial sexual exploitation of a minor, which includes buyers. So who are they? Who are the traffickers? So human trafficking schemes are businesses. It involves money. It involves, it's an economy. So it's helpful to understand human trafficking in terms of various business models. Polaris Project has a document called The Typology of Modern Day Slavery. It's also on their website, and it talks about 25 different business models of trafficking involving different industries, and it gives a little snapshot of the trafficker, a victim or survivor profile, the venues or the industries that this is found in. And it is very, very helpful. It's a really great tool to use when you're doing a training, or just if you're talking in your team about trafficking. And but it emphasizes again that these are business models. These are money-making schemes. So human trafficking operates according to various business models. There's a business manager. Sometimes traffickers, they don't see themselves as traffickers. They see themselves as business managers of a money-making enterprise. It can be a legitimate business can serve as a front for trafficking. The trafficking can be part of the business, or you can have other businesses like a magazine publication or a music studio that is serving as a front for trafficking. It can be a criminal network that's very complex and extensive, where human trafficking is just a part of their money-making enterprise. These are the things that are usually on television episodes, crime shows and stuff. And these do exist. Familial trafficking is something I hate. I just hate even saying that, but it is something that we are becoming more and more aware of its pervasiveness. But children being used as a funding source for the family, either to pay off debts, to trade for drugs. Sometimes we associate this as involved with very impoverished families, but we actually see this in middle or upper middle class families and neighborhoods as well, where a 15-year-old may be kept in a basement in their family home, and the father's friends come and pay to abuse this child. We see abuse that is filmed and photographed and traded. So we need to think about the intersection of commercial sexual exploitation of children and pornography. Abuse that is live streamed, the very low risk way of trafficking. We also know about trafficking people involved in travel and tourism, where people travel outside of the country for the purpose to pay to abuse children, have sex with children. One of the things, interestingly, a few years ago, there was a big law enforcement busted this or learned about this situation in the Philippines, where a bunch of very, very poor parents were selling their children to be abused and live streamed, and the buyers were mostly all American. That was significant and very, obviously very, very sad. Trafficking includes buyers, the people who are purchasing to have sex with children. And if we had time, we could go on about this. Who is doing that, right? Who is purchasing sex with children? And there's a lot of attitudes and assumptions when these folks are interviewed, and when there's research around who is paying for sex with children. And many of them will actually believe that they are helping minors, that the minors are doing this because they like it, because they want to do it. From my experience in working with survivors and working with those who are sex workers, buyers involve all ages, all races, people in places of power, the regular person in the neighborhood. Mostly are males between 20 and 60, and they will travel. They will travel across the state, especially when the children are very young. These are also involve couples. Couples will pay. And not all are considered pedophiles. These would be regular people in the community they don't all have records. They're not all on the sex offender registry, right? There is a book called Made in the USA that one of the stories, and it's a really, really heavy read. One of the stories talks about a child who was trafficked by her uncle and her cousin on the rodeo circuit. Her cousin actually was a co-victim with her when she was very young, but as he grew older, he worked alongside of his uncle to exploit this young girl in the various rodeos. The McCain Institute has published a 6-year analysis of the sex trafficking of minors, and it is a very, very interesting document. The executive summary has a lot of information about traffickers. I just want to recommend that to you. And that gives a lot of information. So we'll talk a little bit about no third party facilitator. We might be more familiar with quote pimp controlled trafficking, or where there is a third party, and sometimes so I just want to talk about that. So this would be minors who are negotiating their own exchanges, and they are still considered victims. So by law, minors cannot consent to commercial sex, even if they are the ones who are posting the ads, negotiating the exchanges of money or drugs. having a book of customers. Even though they're doing that, they still are considered by law a victim of trafficking, right? Examples of this would include youth who are homeless, as we've seen, LGBTQ kids who have left unsafe homes, and minors engaged in drug-seeking behavior. And the youth, the young folks will have different perspectives about their involvement and about their victimization, and we have to remember that. And also we want to ask the question, why are they doing this? Why are kids on the street negotiating sex for, why are they? And we have to think about that. We want to pull back the lens and consider, what is it about our communities where that's happening, right? If we think about prevention, we need to think about those things. But I wanted just to point out, sometimes we might have more empathy for the victim of pimp control trafficking, or where there is a third party facilitator. Do you think we may engage in more victim blaming in sex trafficking cases where there is no third party? What do you, others on your team that you work together with, do you feel like there might be more empathy for one kind of trafficking than another? And I've seen that, and it's kind of easy to understand, and it's something we need to think about, and something we need to check in ourselves and talk about if we see it. Okay. Any questions regarding what we've covered so far? I know I've shared a lot, and I know it's heavy, but any questions so far? I just want to give a chance.
Not seeing any questions so far, Court. I do want to remind folks all the resources that you have been mentioning are in the chat if they want to go back and study for themselves about what you were talking about and how to use. And we encourage folks to use these resources in any conversations or any educational events or trainings that they may have.
That's a good point. Thanks for saying that, Robin. And that's the thing, you may not have a training on trafficking, but if your MD team is getting together, pull out one of those resources and just talk through it. And that will be very meaningful. And of course, you can always contact us as well. So let's talk a little bit about traffickers grooming. Grooming, we know that the general public often assumes human trafficking involves abductions. So it's really important to understand grooming, which is the deliberate process by which offenders gradually initiate and maintain sexual relationships with victims in secrecy. And it allows offenders to slowly overcome natural boundaries. Now, the word gradually for trafficking, that can mean, that timeline can vary from a few days to a year. It can also vary, the timeline can be over the course of a Friday night party where someone is just getting to know somebody. They both need, to go find drugs, and they form this bond, and they're going to do this, and that person ends up being a trafficker. So, but there is a type of grooming where you're overcoming the natural boundaries of another person. So some grooming tactics, a trafficker will create and develop a child's dependency by, here's some of the things that they can do: romantic or sexual relationship, or any kind of emotionally dependent relationship. Mutual dependence on sharing trauma, something that the trafficker and a potential victim has both gone through. They're sharing a mutual dependence on illicit drugs. Monetizing sex. You're doing it anyway, you may as well make money, as a way to sort of shame somebody or making them feel stupid for not taking advantage of something that any smart person would. And that is a tactic that is very well used. Also, traffickers selling a dream, an extravagant, exciting, and unattainable lifestyle, or just a way to get by, to get an education, to go to a different, escape the town that you're in, right? And then safety, attention. And when I say safety, it's all kinds of safety, protection, a type of family, a type of father figure, a person in their life that listens to them, that's dependable, that's there, that takes care of them, right? And we cannot overemphasize the success of an emotionally, relationally, physically dependent victim. When a trafficker does their work, especially on an adolescent, right, that's maybe experiencing neglect at home and abuse at home, this is a very strong bond that takes place. And those of you who work in this field, you know, you are not alone if you have had such a difficult time working with a youth that is absolutely in love with their trafficker. I mean, it is a very, very strong bond. And we can understand that, knowing what we know about adolescent development. The initial behavior of a trafficker will be, you know, the luring and the grooming, the honeymoon stage. And then subsequent behavior usually turns violent and abusive. And the dilemma for the victim is to work really hard and obey all the rules to get back to that, you know, that kind of honeymoon phase, or just to get back to the place where they're not being harmed all the time, right? We're not being beat all the time. And the other thing I wanted to mention that youth will do, they will rationalize prior trauma to their current experience as preferable, right? So they will say, you know, the situation that I'm in right now with this trafficker is better than what I was enduring, you know, back at home. I remember being in a training where she was a forensic interviewer of children, tons of experience, and she said to a 10-year-old who had been trafficked for a while, you know, was talking to her, and the 10-year-old says, "At least I'm not effing my grandfather." And I know that's very harsh and really hard to hear, but it was a turning point in that forensic interviewer's understanding, like, okay, this is how this child is surviving. This is how this child is, you know, is rationalizing in her mind to survive. And we have to understand that. I mean, is it horrifying? Absolutely. But that is their reality. And we have to have some sort of respect for that, if that makes sense. So we've got to understand these are really, really rough situations. So who do traffickers target? The snatch and grab is less common, right? But it does happen. It does happen. Abductions do happen where kids are taken and trafficked. And sometimes, especially when traffickers need to make quick money in a short period of time, they will get someone really quickly. They will traffic them for a weekend and then drop them off and they're done and they've made their money for the weekend. That does happen. But generally, and it will be, you know, someone they know, but generally traffickers target the marginalized, those with few social safety networks, those experiencing housing instability, youth in correctional facilities and foster care, Indigenous, Black, Latinx, gender nonconforming youth, right? Those youth who are already disproportionately represented in systems. Low risk victims for the trafficker, right? Who are the low risk victims for that person? And it's going to be the people who are easily missed, the people that no one's really going to care about. And the trafficker grooms the child and the community. And this is really important too. When I used to train in local communities, I would talk about community attitudes about marginalized populations. The trafficker counts on that, right? They count on racism, on xenophobia, on transphobia, right? Because this reinforces to the kid that no one cares about them. You know, you're not deserving or worthy of help. You're not deserving or worthy of empathy. So that's why those attitudes in our communities absolutely impact trafficking, right? We talk about, oh, I want to fight trafficking. Let's fight racism, right? And I also want to mention intergenerational trafficking when a child is trafficked, when that's a pattern in the family. That can be that's easily missed by systems. Also, I want to just throw out there that hopefully Sky will talk about, or peers who are actually part of the trafficking scheme or other minors. This is very complex and problematic. We often see that victims sometimes turn into and are coerced actually to be part of the trafficking scheme, and that can be very difficult when it's like a child advocacy center or others, our rape crisis center, are serving folks who are also perpetrators or are faced with that, right? Okay. How do traffickers control? This is sort of redundant, but you know, they create dependency, pressure, intimidation, sexual violence, and sexual violence is definitely found in labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking. Sexual violence to control and to punish, threats to family members, threats to exposure. We're going to expose you. We're going to tell everybody that you're gay. We're going to show this film, these photographs. I'm going to put them online. I'm going to show them to your family. And we do know sometimes when families find out that their child has been trafficked or they are so-called a prostitute, they don't accept them back into the family, even if that child has been victimized. But that happens because there's so much stigma on sexual violence. Threats to abandon a person. You know, when a mother tells a child, you know, you tell anybody about this, mommy's going to go to jail and you'll never see me again, that keeps a kid quiet. It really does. So, right. So, just briefly, substance use and traffickers, there's usually a lot of questions around drugs. People say a trafficker will get a person hooked. Well, for youth, young people will use illegal substances to escape the trauma or to numb out in order to endure the trafficking. And then that often turns into an addiction. Traffickers can manipulate drug-seeking behavior and often intentionally create an opioid dependency. So if they're using something else, a trafficker will create an opioid dependency. And of course, you know, we know that someone on heroin is going to be can be very easily controlled. Traffickers who are also drug dealers compel youth to sell drugs, which is a type of trafficking. I just found an article in it's where two people were arrested for compelling youth to sell drugs, and they were arrested as traffickers, which was really great to finally see that language. So if we take a look at young people who are compelled to sell drugs for their gangs or whoever, and we start looking at that as those kids as victims, that should turn things around. And also, I just wanted to mention substance use intersects with the criminalization of victims. When someone is when their trauma is continually criminalized, they're just getting buried right under criminal records, and even if that the drug use was coerced or part of the trafficking scheme. So we want to think about that as well. All right. So identifying trafficked minors, often folks want a list of red flags or a screening tool that's going to absolutely identify a victim. And if you're hoping on that, you're just going to get frustrated, because that rarely absolutely identifies victims. What we want to do is look for patterns rather than individual factors. And if we understand human trafficking from an ecological framework, that includes experiences of not just individual risk factors, but you look at the community, you look at the neighborhood, you look at risk factors that occur in the family, in cultural attitudes and social networks, and we understand how trafficking shows up, and we understand the risk factors, we will be more equipped to identify victims. So we really want to look at patterns. I do want to bring your attention to this article. Relevant risk factors and vulnerabilities include child abuse and maltreatment, caregiver strain, running away or being thrown away, substance use, peer influence, witnessing family violence or criminality, poverty or material need, difficulty in school, conflict with parents, poor mental health or view of self, involvement in child protective services, involvement in juvenile detention or delinquency, early substance use, and prior rape or adolescent sexual victimization. And you'll see in that list, it's not just an individual risk factor, but family dynamics, neighborhood, community living conditions. And I just wanted to point out, when we use the term at risk, we want to take care not to label children. We want to use a strengths-based perspective, but we do know that we're still going to come across at-risk terminology. That is a common terminology, but just we want to take care not to label kids as that is an at-risk kid, right? They're more than that. They're not that, they're more than that. So there are some red flags. I said, you don't want to depend on that one list, but there really are some significant things that give us pause, like, hey, this may be going on. And it's usually involving any kind of sudden change, a sudden behavior change, or a person has new peers, a new older romantic partner, or an older friend, suddenly acquiring expensive things that kid probably cannot really afford, a new tattoo that suggests ownership or gang affiliation, history of commercial sexual exploitation or familiarity with commercial sex. That's actually a big red flag. Running away, living in hotels, having dates, meeting dates in hotels and setting up meetings. And then things like lack of sleep or signs of abuse or neglect with these other things are definitely going to be, it's going to be a pattern. Other changes, there's going to be changes in school participation, increased missed days, leaving and returning, withdrawn from friends, sleep deprived, and trafficked youth may eventually stop attending school due to trauma, or they just see it as pointless. Sometimes the trafficker just pressures them. They think they're making more money, doing something else. So that's going to be an indicator. And so far we've discussed identification based on our own observation. There are other ways of identifying trafficked youth. One would be specifically screening for human trafficking, or screening for other types of trauma or abuse, and having those conversations can lead to disclosures. Forensic interviews, and I wanted to say something about that in a minute. Recovery operations by law enforcement. Sometimes they will recover youth that are being trafficked. Understanding the systems that trafficked minors are a part of. Also, adolescents are often identified because they are already being criminalized by something else. So their trafficking might be discovered as part of an investigation for something else. And that's one of the reasons engaging with these kids can be really, really difficult, because it's already sort of, there's a lot going on, right? So I wanted to mention, there's a really, really great article I found about forensic interviews in children. And I think Robin will probably share that. And I just wanted to mention that for trafficked kids, the forensic interviews are more often conducted not in a child advocacy center, but maybe at juvenile justice or at court or at other places, right? And they, the dynamics of a forensic interview for CSEC victims are going to really differ greatly. And the research is catching up to what we kind of already understood about this population. In terms of a child advocacy center, where the goal is to bring all the services to the child in one place and to conduct a single interview to reduce the traumatic experience of a child having to retell their story, right? Well, we're realizing that one interview is probably not going to result in any kind of disclosure of trafficking or enough evidence to positively identify that trafficking is going on. And that is very frustrating. But there's a lot, this article, those of you who are in child advocacy centers or part of a multidisciplinary team would really, this is a really, really great article that talks about that. As far as, and we'll be more aware that trafficked minors are involved in other systems like CPS and juvenile justice, and that's going to help as well. The thing about all this, it is rare to positively ID trafficking of minors. It is really hard. Most likely other forms of abuse or harm or trauma will be uncovered, and there'll be enough there for us to serve kids, right? There will be enough there. And it's really in building a relationship with those kids, building trust, building rapport where the trafficking is disclosed. Oftentimes, though, the trafficking is it emerge, or you find that out when a child when they are an adult, and they tell you that they were as a child, and no one knew, right? No one knew that that was going on. They knew some kind of abuse was happening. They knew that they were in hotels, but no one really put two and two together. So these cases are really hard. And when I mentioned earlier how overwhelming this topic is, I think that's largely a part of it. It is just really hard. You can be so sure this is going on, but you cannot prove anything, right? And that kid is definitely not going to tell you what's going on, right? So I don't know if that feels encouraging, but if you feel that way, if you've experienced that, you're not alone. That is very typical in working with these children. Okay. Any questions so far? Anything, Robin, to bring attention to or to lift up?
No, Courtney, I'm not seeing anything.
Okay.
We've got some very smart people on here. And I mean, really, because all the things that you name, right? How difficult it is, how we should be careful. And I think they're just thinking through all the things that you have shared so far.
Right. And I will say, no, well, if it's when I'm in trainings and we're talking about kids and we're talking about, you know, I'm slower to ask questions as well, because I don't want anyone else to know that I don't know. You know, no one wants to do the wrong thing here. And we probably all have missed situations, and we probably have misstepped in many ways, but I understand if folks are just not feeling comfortable in sharing, or you're just thinking, and that's totally fine. And feel free to directly send questions to the panelists if you'd rather be anonymous. I should have mentioned that at the beginning in the Q&A feature. Okay, so responding to trafficked youth. Again, these are going to be some general trauma-informed practices, right? This is, again, reminding you of the introductory nature of this training, and we'll do a deeper dive later. So the first thing to say is stay in your lane. And that can sound really condescending. I don't mean to be, but I want to just, I want to address those of us who are eager to provide direct services without experience working for trafficked youth, right? Without experience with systems involved youth, without experience about or enough understanding of those systems, we can do harm even if we are well intentioned. So we want to be really careful before jumping in, and I'll use that word rescuing kids, right? I was talking to someone the other day, and they're ex-military, and they were excited to tell me they're going to be joining this group that's going to go out and rescue these kids. Well, I mean, I didn't say a whole lot because I was trying to be nice, but there's not the type of person that I would want to go and do that. So it's, you hear that a lot, and I just want to emphasize that. Treating a minor's trafficking experience without understanding environmental factors and the harms that kids experience from those systems, when we don't understand that, and we're trying to engage or help kids, we can cause further harm. We can set them up for further harm, right? So I just wanted to mention that we are all mandated reporters in North Carolina. So suspected child abuse and neglect must be reported to the authorities. We want to, above all, establish physical, emotional, and psychological safety whenever we're working with children. We want to be aware that children have experienced trauma in many other ways. We always want to have that at the forefront. And for those of us who are eager to see traffickers arrested and kids, pulled out, and I definitely do. We also need to be aware that law enforcement and social services response can be, and I want to say is always, but I shouldn't, can be very traumatic and frightening for a child and their whole family, right? That in and of itself is a traumatic event. So that should just, you know, we just need to be aware of that. Also to emphasize that the child and family networks as secondary survivors all need support. And maybe your agency can't provide support for that whole family, but please have at the ready in your referral network groups and supports and services that can. So a few more things. And if you do have any specific questions, drop them in the chat or send them directly to us. Trust, sincerity, honesty, and respect is absolutely important, and it goes a long way. And that's what we want to be doing, right? We want to be providing that, establishing that for these kids. Close, caring, interpersonal relationships provide protection and foster resiliency, and you do not need to write a grant for that. Research has shown many, many times relationship with a supportive adult is an absolutely important protective factor in a kid's life. And even for intervention purposes, that is a very, very important support. So those of you who are teachers, those of you who are counselors, who are mentors, you know, that advocates, those are all very important. And that is why a lot of programs around trafficked minors do include mentoring programs. Those are very, very important parts of programs. And if you ever want to talk about that, you can call and contact me, and I'd be very happy to discuss that with you. Trafficked youth, children, it's going to require intensive case management and coordination of services. And that can be a full-time job, really. So anyone working with trafficked minors, that is so very important, and coordinating those services so to do the least amount of harm, because again, all that can be very traumatic for a child and their entire family. Involve the child as much as possible in decisions that impact them. If you're going to have to make a report, include them in the process. I think too often we can forget, oh, they're victims. We know what's best. Well, they've survived. They've survived their ordeal. They know a lot, actually, and they can tell us a lot and teach us a lot. But it is, we should involve them as much as possible. Provide support, as I've said before, for the family and caregivers. And if a child is being moved to a different county or school, provide a warm handoff and prepare for that on day one. Actually, don't wait until, oh, they're leaving the situation next week, moving across the state. So provide that on day one. And this will be my last slide before we have time for questions. I just wanted to address separating a child from their trafficker happens when they become involved in systems. The trafficker may be arrested, maybe, maybe they disappear, they're in the wind. But we want to keep these things in mind. A child may have complex feelings toward that trafficker, and they could be just absolutely in love. They could have that trafficker's baby. That trafficker might be the father of their child. What if the trafficker is mom? What if the trafficker is brother? What if the trafficker is boyfriend or best friend, right? And a child may resent anyone involved in the investigation, especially if they are removed from their home. They may constantly run back to the trafficker or away from placements. I did want to mention with that first part of the child having complex feelings, they sometimes will also protect the family or the community of the trafficker. So be aware of power dynamics and cultural and intergenerational trauma. A child may be very protective of their community, especially if those they are engaging with in another system or service providers are not part of that community. So that's really important to understand. A trafficked youth can feel trapped between feeling like a child and an adult. They've seen a lot, they survived a lot, but they're still maybe 15 years old. And that can be very, very difficult and very confusing, especially when they're suddenly having to to go to school, right? Can have trouble relating to peers. Also, people talk, communities talk, kids talk, so they'll have to go to school and they'll hear the names that they're called behind their backs or online, right? So we have to be aware of those dynamics as well. Kids can also blame themselves, minimize what happened. They can internalize the shame or act out in response. These are all normal responses. They may have no reaction. They may brag about the money they made. They may brag about the sex that they had, right? They may use language that is inappropriate. They may show aggression. These are all survival responses. These are all trauma responses. And these do not help us to feel sorry for that child. This can be very challenging. Maybe those of you who are trained with all the training you've had, you understand this, but you might have other people in your agency or other people on your team that are absolutely offended by this foul-mouthed kid, this punk kid that shows up acting like this when we're working so hard to rescue them, right? These are real situations, so we have to really work hard to check our bias, right? Also, if the child has suffered abuse or neglect at home, any attention to put them back there may be threatening. Any a child that has been neglected by their family or their caregivers, all of a sudden everyone's paying attention, and the only attention they've received is from their trafficker, and that's going to be very confusing. And they are not going to look at you as your rescuer. They are not going to look at you as their savior. Especially if that trafficker provided some sort of emotional security. So the other thing to remember is there's no right way for them to feel, so we don't want to impose feelings on them, but we also don't want to try to turn them against the trafficker, even if the trafficker say arrested, or that can be it's hard because we really do want them we may really want that kid to think of what just happened and then was really, really bad, but they're not ready to say that. So we want to mirror language as much as possible, and understand and listen, really try to listen. And often a kid might want to talk to somebody, a survivor who's been through what they've been through. So we want to try to have networks available if that's possible. But I've worked with many, many survivors. That is what they ask. I just want to talk to someone who's been through what I've been through, that knows what I'm feeling, right? Don't be patronizing or talk down to them. Like I said, they're survivors. They are the expert of their story. Running away is a trauma response often. Running back to the trafficker, we tend to criminalize this, but we have to understand it for what it is. So if there are no questions, I just wanted to say this in closing of this part. It's all about our expectations. If we think less about rescuing a kid, we cannot reverse a lifetime of trauma. We cannot fix this situation, but what we can do is we can show up and meet that kid or that child where they are, right? And we can support them, and we can try to be there for a child who has seen a lot and experienced a lot of pain, and we can, with everything in our power, we can show up and just support them where they are, right? Without promising them the world, without trying to rescue everyone, but that one kid showing up for them, taking them seriously and listening to them, and just understanding these cases are just really, really hard. But you're not alone either. You have NC CASA here to help and support you all as you face child trafficking in your agency. So before we hand it over to Sky, do you all have any questions? Oh, actually, I was going to have Robin share about the Teach to Reach. But are there any questions?
Not seeing any questions yet, Courtney. We'll give it a minute or two. You said you want me to, okay.
Yeah, would you talk about this just to end on some hope?
No, I think folks, we talked about Teach to Reach for the last 2-3 years, and if folks aren't familiar with it, it is a curriculum, and one of the people who have been working on the curriculum is Hannah Beth, who actually wrote that great article, did that research that we put also in the chat as a resource. So we've been working, NC Casa has been working with Cindy Fraga Rizzo and the folks at UNC to create this Teach to Reach curriculum in response to legislation around training school personnel or training kids or educating kids around Teach to Reach. It is a prevention tool, and it is based, just like it says on that slide, around North Carolina Healthy School Standards for 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. In addition, it can be adapted to other settings other than traditional school settings. It can be adapted to alternative schools. It can be adapted to after school programs, but it is really for older kids in that age range, which is around 12 to 15 years old. If folks are interested in Teach to Reach, you can either send us information, us meaning Courtney, myself, Chris, who's involved in the curriculum or teaching the curriculum. The curriculum actually requires folks to be trained on the curriculum prior to receiving the curriculum. But we're happy to have further discussions with you around what that looks like. Courtney also has on this slide the human trafficking prevention matrix that Chris and a fabulous MPH student created for us. We can provide that, and actually NC Casa's human trafficking prevention toolkit. We'll get all these resources to you in the chat. And then after the training, a reminder that we do have a YouTube channel. And so you don't have to remember all this or grab it from the chat. You will be provided. Everyone who attends the training will be provided all these resources. And I will be quiet and turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Sky David.
Hi, everyone. Like introduced, I am Sky David. I am our staff attorney at NC Casa. I want to just start by saying that Courtney and Robin and Chris are really our subject matter experts in human trafficking. I'm just going to be sharing the laws related to human trafficking as they are applicable in North Carolina. And then we are going to move into some scenarios where you all will get to kind of play this out. So we're going to sort of force you into some scenarios to get you thinking about the different situations that could arise and have arisen when serving minors. So human trafficking in minors, just some definitions, and you can see here that I've highlighted in red what I really want you to be able to focus on. Force, fraud, and coercion are not required for the definition of sex trafficking for anyone under 18, but they are required for the legal definition of labor trafficking with minors. So that's really important to see the differences in those two, and I know Courtney covered that a little bit as well. Any commercial sex exchange by a minor is considered sex trafficking, even without a third party. This applies for a minor being violently exploited by an organized professional trafficker, being exploited by an abusive romantic interest, caregiver, or family member, or for a homeless minor who's shown by another homeless minor how they've been surviving, and for a minor who self-initiates commercial sex. Again, here's the highlighted part. Any exchange of sex for anything of value by a minor falls under the legal definition and legal protections of human trafficking. So just to ground us in those definitions, I'm going to move on to North Carolina's specific human trafficking definitions. And the North Carolina human trafficking definitions and language is all found in 14-43.10. That is the general statute this all falls under. And so North Carolina defines human trafficking as when a person knowingly or in reckless disregard of the consequences of the action recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains by any means another person with the intent that the other person be held in involuntary servitude or sexual servitude, or willfully or in reckless disregard of the consequences of the action causes a minor to be held in involuntary servitude or sexual servitude. So under North Carolina law, we're going to talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. For sex trafficking, that involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to induce someone to perform a commercial sex act, such as prostitution, pornography, stripping, or erotic massages. If the individual induced to perform the act is under the age of 18, it's considered sex trafficking regardless of that force, fraud, or coercion aspect. Just a quick side note here. If you're working in a rape crisis center, you know that it can be tricky because the age of consent is 16 in North Carolina, but this is minors are anyone under the age of 18, and that also applies to confidentiality. So just something to keep in mind. Many perpetrators of sex trafficking employ a grooming process to gain a victim's trust and dependence while drawing them away from support networks. I think Courtney covered this well. The process involves acting loving, kind, attentive, and providing the victim with gifts, attention, and praise. As the relationship progresses, the trafficker becomes more demanding, asking for things in return, such as sexual favors for their friends. Then they begin employing various power and control tactics, such as abuse, threats, violence, intimidation, and coercion. All this can be found on the Human Trafficking Commission page. Now for labor trafficking under North Carolina law. Labor trafficking is the most prevalent in industries requiring large amounts of manual labor, such as agriculture, manufacturing, restaurants, and construction. Sales crews are also a known industry for trafficking. Traffickers often rely on deception, economic desperation, and immigration status to entrap victims. They use tactics such as threatening to report individuals to immigration authorities, illegally withholding wages, or debt payments to keep victims locked in a cycle of abuse. Because these industries are usually either geographically isolated or out of public view, it's extremely difficult to detect. Continuing with North Carolina laws. So in North Carolina, human trafficking of an adult constitutes a Class F felony. And again, that's with adult, and Class C felony for cases with children. Convictions carry sentences of jail time, which can stretch to several years. I should say that Class C felonies in North Carolina are the most serious felonies. And that comes with, per the human trafficking chapter, if a minor is involved, the relief includes at least a minimum fine of at least $10,000. So that is included in that sentence. In addition, North Carolina State Legislature has passed several laws intended to protect and aid victims of trafficking, as well to prevent future victimization through education. And those each year come from the Human Trafficking Commission. They recommend to the legislature what laws need to change, and then the legislature passes those laws on an annual basis. So safe harbor, I should note that this statutory citation is 14.43-20. There's an extra zero, so sorry about that. It does provide protections and avenues of aid for minor victims of human trafficking, decriminalizes prostitution-related offenses for minors, and ensures the child welfare system retains jurisdiction over child trafficking victims. So it does a few things. And General Statute 115C-81 it says that boards of education must address sex trafficking awareness and prevention in schools. Both Courtney and Robin covered this as far as what that curriculum could be. And it mandates reproductive health and safety education for 7th graders, mandates sexual assault, sexual abuse, and risk reduction awareness education. Again, if you're looking for resources on that, I think Robin put some in the chat, or you can contact any of us at NC CASA and we can kind of connect you to some resources. The last law we're going to cover is Session Law 2019-245. You may know it as Senate Bill 199. It mandates child sexual abuse and sex trafficking training for all school personnel and expands the rights and protections for child victims of sexual abuse and trafficking, and expands those rights and protections for all victims of sexual assault. I guess that wasn't the last one. Oh, House Bill 198, which is last year's version, or the 2019-2020 biennium's version of the Human Trafficking Agency Bill. It created a civil cause of action for survivors of trafficking to recover damages from perpetrators. Further criminalizes buyer conduct to aid in order to reduce demand for human trafficking, and expands the range of expungable offenses for survivors. So it was a pretty big lift. As you can see, these are pretty big actions taken by the legislature to kind of provide those services to victims. So just covering a little bit minors and their rights in North Carolina. What are they? How does this all add up? North Carolina has few guidelines addressing consent and confidentiality concerns that sexual violence advocates face when serving minors. This is something we hear from rape crisis folks about constantly. It can be confusing, but just with respect to health services, state statute does allow minors of any age to consent to prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of STDs and other communicable diseases, and that includes HIV, pregnancy, not including abortion or sterilization, controlled substance, or alcohol abuse and emotional disturbance. So they are able to consent to those different health services. Other rights in North Carolina. So minors can also admit themselves into a 24-hour facility for treatment of mental illness or substance abuse. The facility must, however, notify the minor's parent of the admission within 24 hours, unless the parent cannot be identified, located, or contacted. When a minor seeks medical services for these types of purposes, the doctor cannot discuss medical services with the minor's parents without the minor's consent, except when the situation indicates that the parental notification is essential to the life or health of the minor. However, the doctor may disclose medical information if the parent contacts the doctor concerning treatment or services being provided to the minor. So, furthering healthcare. While North Carolina law gives parents the right to consent to healthcare for a minor child, it does not give explicitly the parents the right to object to medical treatment. So section 90-21.1 states a doctor cannot administer treatment to a minor over a parent's authorized objection unless the physician first gets a second opinion that treatment is necessary to prevent immediate harm to the child. And it specifically says that they should have the, quote, approval of either the father or mother of said child or any person acting as guardian or any person standing in loco parentis. And what does that mean? The person that has assumed parental responsibilities for a child. So you could see a situation here where the person that has, quote, assumed parental responsibilities for a child could be the trafficker, and how that may present some issues with healthcare. So some other topics we would like to discuss: who has privileged communications and what organizations are providing direct services to victims who are not DVSA need to understand, like who could obtain those case notes, etc. So if you have ever done any confidentiality trainings with me, you know that I say the less notes, the better, the best. Keep them short, sweet, and vague as much as you can. And with confidentiality and minors, some questions that come up: how can we treat them? We can't place them residentially, cannot move them either, and consent versus confidentiality. So consent to services and confidentiality when you are doing intake with a minor. This is something that we really try to stress at NC CASA. Like, let them know what the scope of your confidentiality is, and when you will have to break confidentiality up front. Have a conversation, be open, and ensure that it is survivor-centered and the survivor is in the center of what you are doing. And let them know, if I hear about abuse, neglect, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, whatever that may be, that's a mandatory report and I will have to report it. Just so they know and aren't further into a place where they are traumatized by you then springing this on them. So other concerns: mandatory reporting, parents demanding records, and like I said, you cannot offer full confidentiality during intake.
Sky, I wanted to mention, okay, there was a question in the chat about describing the expectations of a local DSS agency once a HT report is made and accepted for investigation, and if the parent is not the trafficker. Robin referred to the chart that you've created to help us understand. So I just wanted to let you know that question was raised.
Yeah, share that.
Okay, cool. And then
I will quickly say that, so the DSS agency has to look into that and report to law enforcement within 48 hours if it is a credible claim. And so there are some specifics that DSS has to follow, and we will get you that full chart. So we're moving into the scenarios. And here's where I would say, please unmute yourself. This requires participation, so someone has to participate. So let's say a peer who is also a minor is discovered recruiting or part of the trafficking scheme. How would you respond to that situation? I'll just take this time to remind you, I think Courtney went over this a little bit earlier, that minors cannot consent even if they are part of a trafficking scheme. Yes, Robin's saying, please feel free to unmute yourself, share directly in the chat. You can share just to panelists if you'd like, or just speak up. Maybe this raises some questions for you. What are the questions?
I can share. Sky, what if you don't serve perpetrators in your facility? What happens?
That's a great point.
I guess I didn't say anything. I just asked a question. Sorry.
That's fine. If you have questions that come up, raise your questions. I would love to hear some folks that are at a rape crisis center or a CAC, what that would look like for them.
Sky, we do have a question in the chat. Can a minor be charged for recruitment? I know there are laws in place protecting minors from associated charges stemming from human trafficking. If folks want to talk about this or share their thoughts in the chat, please feel free to do so, or unmute yourself.
So that question is incredibly complicated and a great question to raise here, that maybe that minor was recruiting or is recruiting actively, and what if they are also a victim, or if you are not considering them a victim in this scenario? Is that what I'm getting?
So Jordan, please feel free to unmute yourself. This is a safe space for everyone to share. These topics are incredibly, incredibly complicated. So Jordan says, I work in the hospital setting. We consider all patients involved or suspected in human trafficking.
Great. Great. So that child would not be able to be charged. That is protected under 14-43.15.
Someone else says it would be a tricky situation with us here. The minor is probably a victim, which is why they became a perpetrator. Oh, Sky already responded. Sorry, Sky. That's right. With an exclamation point.
All right, maybe we'll move on to the next one. So when a minor is presenting at an ER or healthcare facility, and lucky us, we have some of those folks on this call, with indicators of victimization accompanied by a person who is considered to be the trafficker or controller, what options are available to the healthcare provider while waiting on CPS or law enforcement to respond? Specifically, what options do you have in separating the victim from the supposed trafficker? Like, how are you going to make sure that they don't leave that healthcare facility with that person? So feel free to unmute yourself, respond in the chat. Alexandra, there's a question from Jordan saying, I called.
Yeah, she's unmuted her, Scott. Jordan, you're already unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I work at Atrium Health. We are a Trauma One center in the middle of a major metropolitan area. We often, I would say at least once a day, have a suspected victim. We did have an incident over the weekend where the child was considered to be accompanied by a person that was a controller. And so what we did to respond was we requested that the person provide their identification. They initially declined. Also the suspected controller was refusing to leave the exam room, to leave the minor by themselves. And so at that point we stated, if you won't leave voluntarily for part of this, then we will have to contact security or local law enforcement to have you escorted off the premises to assess for safety. And at that time, the person did identify themselves. It was confirmed with local DSS that that was the guardian, and they did leave the room to allow us to discuss things privately with the minor. So it's my understanding that we do have the right to ask them to step out of the room, at least for part of the exam.
Thank you. That was so helpful to hear an actual hypothetical play out. I also just want to re-emphasize here something that Courtney really touched on, and that was the coordination of services, ensuring that folks that are working with minors, you know who those services are, who the resources are, and you can connect them to what they need in this specific situation. Maybe we'll just do one more before wrapping up. A 16-year-old is identified as a sex trafficking victim in a police operation. Their parents, guardians cannot be located or contacted. It's 2 a.m. on a Saturday. Law enforcement wants to put them in lockup as a safe place. The Rape Crisis Center advocates and CPS are involved in trying to seek other legal options available. What are your options in this situation?
Okay, this is Jordan again. Sorry to be the only one talking. So in this situation, our hospital specifically would, what we would have recommended to our local law enforcement is to contact our team. We are a human trafficking response team that is active 24/7. And then that minor would be brought to the emergency department, and then we would involuntarily commit them under the verbiage of that the minor lacks appropriate decision-making capacity to something along the lines of ensure their safety and well-being. And then we would, work for whatever CPS recommendations are, as well as whatever law enforcement recommendations are in regard to a safe discharge disposition.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jordan, for sharing. I think it's really helpful for folks to hear how this will play out in the healthcare situation versus at a rape crisis center. So that's really helpful. Margaret put in the chat that, there were a couple other comments. To encourage CPS to possibly take temporary custody. Found. And then Margaret said on a recent training, they were told that radiology is a good option for ensuring privacy for speaking with a possible trafficking victim. Yeah. Okay, Mel asked if a minor admits themselves to a 24-hour care, can they also sign themselves out? Yes, they can.
She said before the 24 hours are up.
Yes.
Sky, would we have time to touch on that last one, scenario 5?
Sure.
Okay. I think it's important to try to get that one in.
Okay, so an adult survivor disclosed to an advocate they were trafficked as a child and identified the trafficker. Let's say they disclosed to the staff at an NGO or disclosed to a sexual assault advocate. Does this require a report to law enforcement or DSS according to the new law? So the new mandatory reporting law. I see Brittany's question here about witness protection being a possibility. I do just want to raise that in the human trafficking chapter 14-43.17 does give victim confidentiality and doesn't allow for disclosure of their records during a court case. So this scenario, if no one wants to talk about it, I will note that, so if it was a minor who does disclose that they were trafficked, that's a mandated report under 7B101, abuse, neglect, dependency. Human trafficking is specifically listed in that as a mandated report. So the new law would have no impact on that. But if it is an adult who is disclosing that trafficking as a child, let's say they disclose that to a sexual assault advocate. One, I would say that this law only went into effect on December 1st, 2019. So it only applies to offenses committed on or after that date. So with that in mind, anybody have any further thoughts on maybe if there is someone who is a trafficker and maybe others are in harm, how you would respond, knowing that it's unlikely that this offense occurred after 2019 and they are now an adult? It would be a very short period of time for that, but it could happen. A 17-year-old and now they are 18. Okay, I'll just answer. What we say to folks, especially at rape crisis centers and CACs, is if you don't know whether someone is in danger or not, you should go ahead and report. There is that good faith immunity in mandated reporting. So if there is no one in harm's way, you still are protected by that immunity. However, you also might be saving some other minor who is potentially at risk for being trafficked. Yes, Jamie said law enforcement should still be notified in case there are other victims. Yes. When in doubt, go ahead and report, but you're not legally required to based on the new law unless that person was under 18 at the time and the offense occurred after that date. But again, just another quick reminder that if they are a minor, it is a mandated report no matter what.
It looks like we're at our time. I thought I'd share our contact information. Thank you all for joining